welcome to Butterflies of Wisdom, everyone. If you hear side notes of something trying to get scared off, that's because I had a bear show up at my house at 7 o'clock this morning, a medium-sized bear, and that's what you get when you live in Aspen, Colorado, and the bears like to go through the trash can. So if you hear a side note of something trying to get scared off while doing this interview, don't mind the animal background noise. But I do have Cheri Field with me, and the reason why I'm bringing her on again is because she is a second-generation homeschool mom, and not only homeschool, but she has a podcast which I believe teaches science kids, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cheri, but yeah, I'm going to let Cheri take it away.
Okay. Yeah, and the other thing that would connect with your audience is every single member of my family, including myself, has ADD and dyslexia to some extent or other. For me, it just keeps me from spelling well. But I've got one sister who still has trouble reading even though she likes it. So that's something else we've had to deal with as a family.
Yeah. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, why did you decide to homeschool your kids? I know you're a second generation homeschooling parent, but because of the challenges with ADD, you thought it would be better if the teachers didn't recommend they stick your kids on speed. Molly, for those of you who don't know what speed is, it's a version of Molly, and it's actually in the ADD and ADHD world, it's called Vigilant. And so what a lot of traditional teachers do is stick these kids on Vigilant and call it good. So why did you decide not to send your kids to traditional schooling?
Yeah. Well, for me, I had such a good experience. As my parents, I barely remember, but when I was 6, I was doing so well academically, I could read well and all that I was still 5, and they put me up with the second graders who were 7, and they were expecting me to hold still in line and follow very strict regimented stuff, and I was just unhappy. And they said, when we started homeschooling you, we got our happy, bouncy daughter back. So that was always in the back of my mind, that this was something my parents did even when it was hard. My mom often struggled with feeling inadequate, but they would never give up because they knew it had made such a difference in my own life. And so for me, I remember when I graduated high school, kind of sitting down and thinking through, okay, what did I most appreciate about my education? What would I like to do differently? And I never really considered any other option, partly because I'm a natural-born teacher. I love to just share what I've learned with other people. That's one of the great joys in my life. And I'd rather teach my own kids if that's an option. I have done some piano teaching and stuff, so even if I'd ended up never having my own kids, I wanted to teach. So, and I knew the odds were pretty good. My kids would struggle like I did, and especially if it's boys. You're right. Ritalin does work. I had one brother that even for homeschooling, there was a year or two just to get him over the hump on reading that he was using Adderall, I think is the one that's extended release, and even there it would only last for like 4 hours with him. Yeah. But, sorry?
I said, oh boy, because they expect the kids in the traditional setting to be on Ritalin and Molly for the extended, more than 4 hours, my God. But to each their own, that some of these medications, like Ritalin, don't work. Well, they work for some individuals, but they don't work.
Right. Yeah, for my brother, it did work. He was able to calm down long enough to memorize his ABCs and work on his phonics, because that's what I tell all people going into homeschooling. If you end up where your child graduating from high school knows how to read, knows how to balance a checkbook, and knows how to learn more, then you're successful. And my parents waited until he was 8 or 9. I don't remember exactly. They let him be a little kid as long as possible. That's one of the things I knew for all my children is, like, I'm not going to push them too early, because the goal, again, is to create lifelong learners who love the experience of education. And especially for boys, that can often be delayed by a few years. Just let them run around. But yeah, for us, everybody in my family, if we have real coffee, like me, before I podcast, I always have a cup of real coffee, because it helps my mind to think clearly, to be able to produce the best quality product. So for us, it does work. But yeah, it does affect the appetite. I know my brother was awful skinny, and that you can have, everything has side effects. So the biggest thing is, did I want to tailor my child with medicine or whatever to match the education, or did I want to tailor the education to match my children? And for me, it was a no-brainer. And even then, I started, as I realized my oldest, she's got ADD, something fierce, I looked for, like, especially math, a math curriculum that would go fast and short so she could learn in bursts, which is what we need as ADD. Sit down for 10 minutes. I would actually write it out for her for a few years, so she only had to concentrate on the thinking and not getting the shapes out of her hand. So all those things you can definitely tailor so much better homeschooling than in a public school teacher, and even a private school teacher can't go and actually write the 7s and the 8s with each kid. It would take all day.
It would take all day.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, I'm actually transferring positions in my own job. I've been teaching traditionally in a private school for 11 years. I actually began my career in public school teaching, believe it or not. And that's a whole different kind of fish. And so you're absolutely right. What you can do in the amount of 24 hours, we can't do in an 8 to 3 job. So that's why I applaud homeschool teachers, because what they can do in the time span of a week, we have problems with, because we have the not only the kids, but we have parents, we have the admins, we have everything else that goes around. So at least you guys don't have the admins per se, but you do have to follow state standards. I know that. But can you tailor those state standards to your child's needs?
Yes, right.
Yes.
Yeah, and you can fit it around their schedule. Like, one of the things that they know, American kids and other developed countries are often chronically sleep deprived. And in homeschooling, that's usually not an issue, because you can get things done, and when they're going through a growth spurt, you can let them sleep into 10 o'clock if that's what it needs, and then they often get their work done way faster because they're well rested. So you end up with a net asset, even though you're spending fewer hours in the academic setting.
Yeah. And it's interesting, we talked about homeschooling this morning, and it's interesting, I'm going to be interviewing someone later on why test scores are so low. I got close by an interview about, he wants to come on and talk about why test scores are so low. So when you test in homeschooling, do you actually test the academics? Or no? Do you, again, tailor it towards your child?
Yeah, it depends entirely on your situation. I know I took some CAT tests and things in my youth. My mom felt better knowing. I actually thought it was one of the most fun things I did. And again, several states like Pennsylvania, New York, and I believe California require regular testing. For me, I'm probably not I'll introduce my kids to what it's like to go through a test in their high school years, and so they won't be shocked when they get to the SAT. But because I live in Michigan, I don't have to do testing, so I have chosen, it's called Charlotte Mason, and her approach, where it was pretty much the way you test your child is to have them do an oral or written essay. So that's part of why I do the podcast, because that is essentially what a podcast is for them. They do their report on elephants or the laws of motion, and that is their form of testing. It proves what has actually gotten into their brain, and the odds are they're much less likely to be totally blank when you ask them the same question in a couple days. Like me, I had regular tests like everybody else does, and you asked me a week later what it was I tested on, and very few things could I remember.
Yeah. So you're using the podcast as a platform to test not only their speaking skills, which is a good thing, because each kid needs to get in a public speaking class at some point.
Yes.
Some thought at some point. And so, but you're testing to see how well they can memorize materials.
Right. And their comprehension.
And do it in a fun way at that, and their comprehension.
Yeah. So a lot of homeschoolers do regular tests. There are even ones where you send in their paperwork to a central location, and they keep track of test scores. We've got people in my church that's what they do, and watch videos. It's very much like being in a class, except you decide when to start it. And so every family is different, which, again, you can tailor it both to the children and to the parents and find something that works for everybody.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because now that I think about it, my next college degree is kind of like homeschooling because it's self-paced. I mean, when I talked to them, I thought it was going to be like I have to sign up, I have to attend class once a week, the teacher's going to be there. They go, no, you have a week to do the work, but it's self-paced. And so my next college degree out of the Academy of Arts is kind of like homeschooling in a way, because it's self-paced, and even though I only have a week to do it, it's going to be perfectly fine because I can work on little bits here and there within that week. And so do they, I don't know how to phrase this question, Cheri, but I'll phrase it this way. Do they have colleges set up like homeschooling where the kids will succeed even more?
Well, if you look around all your online ones, unless they have where you have to attend a live lecture and you have to turn in your test in a certain time frame where they set all that, anything done online is essentially the same thing as what a lot of homeschoolers experience. So, actually for adult education, it's very common to have pretty much a homeschool type setup, as I'm glad you noticed. Yeah.
I noticed that about a month ago. I'm like, okay, this is going to be winter homeschooling, because I always thought for years that homeschoolers had the icky tendency. And as we are on this podcast today, what stigma would you like to break during your second interview with me that the public should know about homeschooling? Not only that we love our kids so much we wouldn't go to the end of the earth, but what stigmas that are out there that you would like to break as a second generation homeschooler?
Sure. Well, there is the idea. First of all, the one that was very common and is finally clearing up, as far as I can tell, is that we're unsocialized. Because a lot of early families especially realized their kids were struggling either by being bullied or because they were painfully shy already in a public school setting. They're like, let's stop this misery and just bring them home. So then you end up with still painfully shy young people. For me, I found the only ones that I ever had trouble socializing with were kids my own age until they graduated from college. And then they started caring about things that mattered. Before that, they cared about what clothes are common this year, what's the latest movie, what's the latest fad, and I couldn't care less. I always got along great with younger kids and older people. So that's something that's very common. The other thing, they still try to do the academic and say, well, it's just skewed and biased, but that's becoming less and less common. There is also a lot of us do homeschool because of our religious and moral convictions. Like when you look at what's happening in the school setting, a lot of parents say, I don't want my kids exposed to that yet and not in that fashion. So that is another thing that factors into a lot of our choices. And there can be stigma against how can you be so narrow-minded. So in a way, that's kind of true, but I'm going to let my kids know what the culture is actually like, but when they are ready to handle it, not when they're in second grade.
And it's interesting because I have been bullied, but never by kids. I was bullied by my own family, and many years after school went out. But it's interesting that you say you got along with older kids and younger kids. I got along with older kids and adults at the age of 6. So thinking about it, my mom said this to me at one point. If she would have known what the public school had to offer, she would have pulled me out of private school in 5th grade, sent me over to the public school, or if worst comes to worst, she would have homeschooled me, because I feel like now that I know what I know, I feel like you can do everything and anything underneath the auspices of homeschooling, whereas with the traditional academics, you can't do a podcast under the auspices of a history course. And I'm thinking of Liz Covert's podcast, the Ben Franklin. Well, I just remembered the podcast name. And so what she's doing is teaching people about Ben Franklin. And what you're doing is teaching people about science and teaching kids how to speak properly and how to do all this stuff properly that I didn't learn until I was in my 20s.
Yeah. There are, again, a few educators that are recognizing the power of podcasts, but you know the limitations, how difficult it is to get one started, to be able to fit it into the time frame you have to work with. Yeah. But there are a few educators out there that get it, and I'm excited. I hope more and more of them do help kids realize the power they can have. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about your podcast a little bit. What has been your favorite podcast episode you have done? Well, I know I mentioned last time that my favorite one was the first time I had my son Steven, who he's going to be a scientist, and he was just so excited that still he brings so much enthusiasm to what he says. Like this last time he was one of the co-hosts, so I guess I can do that. The most recent one was a lot of fun for us. And I have them help with the calls to action at the end where we say, hey, could you leave us a rating and review and all that good stuff. And when Steven's reading it, he just gets such a thrill out of it. And the other thing is I have two focuses in mind because it's creation science. So I have both the straight science, like the laws of motion, but I also show how the Bible connects with science. So when I've been able to show, like this time, that the Bible definitely seems to be talking about an extinct flying reptile, in an obscure place in Isaiah that kids are never going to hear about in Sunday school. And I just love being able to bring those out and say, isn't this awesome? We have a book that talks about things that you think are only in the fossil record, and yet they're talking about them as alive. So I love bringing kids into seeing how something written thousands of years ago, and I believe by the hand of God, can be so cool for a child of 6 or 8. That's probably my favorite thing besides hearing my kids grow up.
Hearing your kids grow up, and quite frankly, what you're doing is teaching them a skill that they'll never forget.
Mm-hmm.
I just got told this morning by someone that when you're turning into an artist, if you don't think about it. And so that is so cool that I am turning into an artist and I don't even think about it. But you're, in a sense, you're turning a legacy that you and I didn't have when we were growing up. I mean, podcasting is a really new thing.
Right.
And the fact that you're bringing this to the next generation is, I think it's phenomenal. And the fact that you're using it as a live textbook, so to speak, I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it's one of the things, whenever I tell people, you know those exercises where you had to write a letter to your grandma, but it was in your textbook so you couldn't actually tear it out and send it to her. It's like, what's the point? I don't have that problem with my kids. When I say, you need to have your science report, I don't tell them how many, because it's over 200 now. And that kind of scares them to think of that many people listening to me. But I do say, you've got to get it done, because kids are actually listening. And that's huge. And I
kids
love
and adults are actually listening.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, I know.
It
still blows my mind. Yeah.
It
still
blows
from
my
them.
mind too.
Yeah. That's where, new listeners, if you let Wynn know, it will make her day. I guarantee it.
Yeah. And then you tell your kids they'll actually have a new fan of science reports here, because I'll be tuning into your podcast. So you might want to tell them it's 201. You might want to tell them 201 people are listening, just so they have a clear understanding. But did they ever feel ashamed of their ADD or ADHD? Did they ever feel the stigma of a disability?
Not really. Again, my whole family. Now, I did find a book where it talked about women having ADD, which I had picked up from my daughter. And as I started reading it, I started recognizing my mom more and more. And so when I pointed out to her, it's like, Mom, you match a lot of these symptoms. She was kind of shocked, and that was a real comfort for her, because she'd felt ashamed. But for my kids, because I've been aware of it for so long, that I just kind of make it, well, like when Steven's not answering, it's like, well, that's because he really is in his other world. That, no, I have not found that they struggle much with not feeling important. I do have one son, but it's more that he gets to where he just can't think to express himself, and I think he finds that something shameful.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask, where can people find you again? And then I'm going to have you ask me 2 questions that you've been dying to ask me.
All right. Well, you can find my website at creationscience4kids.com, or to go straight to my podcast page is shorter. I bought cs4ks.com. So that's where I am. I've got a Facebook page, Creation Science for Kids, and I don't like Twitter, but I am there. So those are the main places to find me. I was really thinking about questions for you. So I've got one big one for you, Wynn. I'm out and about you ready?
Yep.
Okay. When I'm out and about with my children and we see someone who either doesn't sound like everybody else or doesn't look like everybody else, what would you want them to know about it, what it's like to be in a person who doesn't fit into society's norm shoes? What is your experience like? And I suppose the second part would be, then what could they do to show that they still care about such a person?
Well, one, a lot of the able-bodied world thinks we're dummies, thinks that we don't have life on in our brains like homeschoolers do. They think we're on socialized, and that's not true as with homeschoolers. So a lot of the stigma around the word disabled is that the disabled and the handicapped, even though that's a politically incorrect word now, but a lot of people think we're dummies. So what I would like people to understand, Cheri, is that we're not dummies, one.
Right.
Homeschoolers and the disabled are not dummies. So we all socialize to the best of our abilities. And so what I would like your kids to understand, and all kids to understand, is that if you go up and say hi to a disabled person, that would make their day. If you hold the door open for a disabled person, that would also make their day because it makes their getting in the door a little bit easier.
Right. Yeah, I know that just having strollers. I need people to hold the door for me. So anytime you've got wheels, you can help.
Yeah, anytime. Anytime that you got a stroller or wheelchair, just hold the door open.
Yeah. Now we kind of have our That's awesome.
That's what I would like to say.
Thank you. My mom, she was in a rollover car accident, so she can still walk a short distance, but spends a lot of time in public sitting in a wheelchair, partly for the walking and also for her back support. Yeah. And so they do know a bit about wheelchairs, but just knowing that it's okay to actively engage with people instead of just ignoring them, that's huge. Thank you.
Actively engage with people instead of just turning a blind eye. And do not, and I'm going to be repeating this, do not say loud enough so the disabled can hear it. Why is that grandma in a wheelchair? Or why is that a child in a walker? That drives me nuts. And people have done it to me over the years, and I'm like, you guys have just pushed a button that I don't want to be pushed. So, and you can tell your mom that I said that. Don't have the public ask, why is that grandma in a wheelchair when they see you pushing her down the street or her grandchildren pushing her down the street. So that's what I would like to say to all kids and all adults out there is just be aware that the disabled are here and they're here to stay, and we do have brains, and just break the stigma of disabled and break the stigma of homeschooling.
Thank you. That sounds awesome.
Well, it was awesome to have you on again, and you guys, you can contact Cheri. All her information will be in the show notes, and I know that her podcast is found on every podcast player under the sun because she uses Libsyn.com, and Libsyn.com is the greatest podcast host ever known to man. They have great customer support, even though they don't sponsor this podcast. I'm just throwing that out there. If you guys want to get into podcasting, talk to Cheri or I, and we'll talk you down a little bit of your feelings because it's always daunting the first time you do a podcast. So I thank you, Cheri, for spending the half an hour we did this morning, and
Mm-hmm.
I just hope that people got a better understanding of the disabled, and especially a better understanding of homeschooling and what it's really like. Thanks to you guys.
Yeah, thank you.